He slapped my pregnant daughter across the face. His mother watched, and then she laughed. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just reached into my purse, pulled out my phone, and scrolled to a name I hadn't called in 3 years. The man who ran the hospital board. The man her son needed more than he knew. My name is Carol, and what I built in the 60 days that followed that moment ended a career, exposed a family, and gave my daughter back everything that had been taken from her. Let me take you back to where this story really starts. Not to that living room. Further, back to the morning my daughter Melissa came home from her sophomore year of college with a boy I hadn't met yet. A boy who held the door open and shook my hand with both of his and smiled in a way that was just slightly too practiced to be entirely real. His name was Dr. Kevin Hargrove. Well, not yet a doctor at that point. A medical student, 3rd year. Ambitious in the way that certain people are ambitious, when they've been told their whole lives that ambition is the same thing as character. His mother, Sandra Hargrove, called me 2 weeks after that first visit to introduce herself. She told me her son was exceptional. She said it the way people say things. They've been saying so long. They've stopped noticing they're saying them. I was polite. I'm always polite. It costs nothing, and it tells you a great deal about the person on the other end of the conversation, how they respond to warmth they haven't earned yet. Sandra responded to my warmth by talking about Kevin for 45 minutes, without asking a single question about Melissa. I noted that. I didn't act on it. I told myself she was just a proud mother. I told myself Melissa was happy. And Melissa was happy, genuinely, visibly happy, in the way that young people are happy when they're in the middle of something that feels like the beginning of their whole future. So I smiled and I helped plan the wedding, and I wrote the check for the reception that Sandra had very clear opinions about, and I told myself that what mattered was my daughter. Melissa and Kevin married when she was 24, and he was finishing his residency. He was going into cardiology. His father had been a cardiologist. His grandfather had been a cardiologist. The Hargrove name meant something at Mercy General, and Kevin had been groomed to extend that meaning since before he could read. Sandra made sure everyone at the wedding understood this. She gave a toast that was technically about the couple, but that was actually about the Hargrove legacy and Kevin's place in it. I sat at my table, and I watched my daughter's face during that toast, and I saw something move across it quickly, something that was not quite the expression of a woman, listening to a toast at her own wedding, and then it was gone, and she was smiling again. I noted that too. The first 2 years of the marriage were, as far as I could see, functional. Kevin was busy in the way that residents are busy. Long hours, exhaustion, the particular stress of a career, where mistakes have consequences that most careers don't. I gave him room for that. Melissa gave him more room than I would have. She adjusted her own schedule around his, took on more of the household management, made herself smaller when she was trying to hold something together that required constant maintenance. I saw it. I didn't say anything, because Melissa hadn't asked me to say anything, and because I had promised myself when she got married that I was going to be a mother-in-law who was present without being intrusive. That promise cost me something in those 2 years. I paid it anyway. She called me on a Tuesday evening, about 26 months into the marriage, and told me she was pregnant. 8 weeks along. She sounded happy and also a little afraid, which is the only honest way to sound when you're telling your mother you're having a child. I cried. She cried. We talked for an hour. Kevin was pleased about the pregnancy, in the way that Kevin was pleased about things, briefly, prominently, in ways that centered his own response. Sandra called me 3 days later to inform me that the baby would be named after Kevin's grandfather. If it was a boy, she didn't phrase it as a preference. She phrased it as an announcement. I told her Melissa and Kevin would make that decision together. Sandra said, of course, with a tone that made clear she considered the matter settled. The incident happened when Melissa was 19 weeks pregnant. I want to describe it carefully, because the details matter, and because I've thought about those details every day since. It was a Sunday. Sandra had organized a family lunch at her house. Her house, which was large and decorated in the way of houses, where the decoration communicates net worth rather than taste. I arrived at 12:30. Melissa and Kevin were already there. Melissa was showing beautifully, in the way of women who carry pregnancies, with a kind of wholeness that is physical and emotional at the same time. She looked tired. Kevin looked the way Kevin usually looked, composed and slightly elsewhere. Lunch was the way lunch at Sandra's was always. A performance of family in which Sandra directed, and the rest of us played our assigned roles. Kevin was attentive when Sandra was watching, and distracted when she wasn't. Melissa ate carefully, the way pregnant women do when they're managing nausea, and she deflected Sandra's comments about her food choices, with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for a while. After lunch, Sandra asked Kevin to help her with something in the kitchen. Melissa and I were in the living room. I was asking her how the nursery planning was going. And then Kevin came back in from the kitchen without Sandra, and he said something to Melissa in a low voice that I didn't fully catch. Something about a conversation they'd apparently had earlier. Something about her mother being there too often. Something in a tone that had no business being used in that room. Melissa said something back, quietly, not aggressively, the kind of response you give when you're trying to keep something from escalating. And he slapped her, open hand, across the left side of her face, hard enough that her head moved. I was on my feet before I understood I had stood up. And then Sandra came in from the kitchen doorway. She had heard it. She had been close enough to hear it. And she looked at the room, and she looked at her son, and she laughed. Not loudly. A short, sharp sound that was worse than loud would have been. And she said, "Melissa, you know how he gets when he's tired." I looked at my daughter's face. The mark was already there. She was holding her hand against her cheek, and she was looking at the floor, and she was doing the thing that broke my heart completely. She was trying to make herself very still. The way people make themselves still when they've learned that movement makes things worse. I picked up my purse. I told Melissa to get her coat. She looked at me, and something in my face told her not to argue. She got her coat. Kevin said something as we were leaving. I don't remember what, exactly, because I had already left the room in the way that I leave rooms. When I've made a decision, and the decision is made. Sandra said something too. I didn't respond to either of them. I got Melissa to my car. I got her to my house. I got her inside, and I got ice for her face. And I sat with her on the couch for 2 hours, while she told me things she had not told me before. Not everything. I don't think she had words for everything yet, but enough. Enough for me to understand that what I'd seen in that living room was not the first time, and that the way she'd been making herself smaller for 2 years was not just the adjustment of a young marriage. It was something else. When she fell asleep on my couch, I went to the kitchen and I opened my phone, and I scrolled to a name. Now I need to stop right here, because who that name belonged to and why I had it, and what I did with it. That's the part Kevin and Sandra never saw coming, not even close. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button right now and ring that bell, because what I built in the next 60 days is something I spent 30 years in healthcare administration, learning how to build, and I didn't waste a single day of that experience. I spent 30 years as a healthcare administrator, not a doctor. I want to be clear about that distinction, because it matters to what comes next. I ran departments. I managed budgets. I navigated the specific politics of hospital systems, which are as complex and consequential as the politics of any major institution. I understood how hospitals worked from the inside, Not just the medicine, but the structure, the credentialing, the oversight, the places where accountability existed, and the places where it was supposed to exist, but sometimes didn't. I had retired 3 years earlier, but I still had relationships. And one of those relationships was with a man named Richard Okafor, who was currently the chairman of the Board of Trustees at Mercy General, the hospital where Kevin Hargrove held a cardiology fellowship, and had recently been recommended for a full attending position. Richard and I had worked together for 6 years, earlier in my career, before he moved into board governance, and I moved into administration at a different system. We had stayed in touch in the way that people stay in touch, when they respect each other. Occasional calls, a lunch when we happen to be at the same conference, the kind of relationship that is real, without being constantly tended. I had not called him in 3 years. I called him the night my daughter fell asleep on my couch, with ice on her face. He answered on the second ring. I told him I needed to talk to him about something serious, and that it involved a member of his medical staff. He said, "Carol, tell me what's happening." I told him, not emotionally. I was past the emotion by then and into something more useful. I told him what I'd witnessed. I told him what Melissa had told me. I told him about the mark on her face, and about Sandra's response, and about the pattern Melissa had described. And I told him that I was calling him not as a grieving mother, though I was that, but as someone who had spent 30 years in healthcare administration, and who understood that what I was describing, a physician with a pattern of domestic violence, was exactly the kind of credentialing and conduct issue that boards of trustees existed to address. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" I told him I needed 2 things. First, I needed him to understand that I was going to pursue this through every appropriate channel, and that I was calling him as a courtesy, and as someone I trusted, not because I expected him to act on a phone call. Second, I needed to know the correct formal process for submitting a conduct concern regarding a credentialed physician. He told me. He also told me something else, something that he said carefully, and that I understood he was telling me because he trusted me. He said that Kevin Hargrove's credentialing review for the attending position was currently in process, and that the review period was, as a matter of board policy, the appropriate time for any relevant information about conduct to be formally introduced into the record. I thanked him. I told him I'd be in touch through the proper channels. Over the next 3 weeks, I did 3 things simultaneously. First, I helped Melissa. This was the most important thing, and I want to say that clearly, because I don't want you to think the strategy was what I cared about most. I cared about my daughter. I got her connected with a domestic violence advocate, a woman named Jennifer, who worked with a nonprofit I knew through my professional network, and who was experienced and steady. Jennifer helped Melissa begin to understand the shape of what she'd been living in. I helped Melissa find a family law attorney. I helped her document what had happened, the incident I witnessed, the pattern she described, the photographs of her face. We took those photographs that evening, before the mark faded. Second, I contacted a patient advocate organization that tracked physician conduct concerns, a legitimate nonprofit that maintained records, and connected people to appropriate reporting channels. I made an inquiry. Through that inquiry, I found something that Kevin had not disclosed on his credentialing application, and that the credentialing committee had not discovered. 2 years earlier, at his previous residency program, there had been a formal complaint filed against Kevin by a nurse, who alleged that he had grabbed her arm during a disagreement in a way that left bruising. The complaint had been handled internally. It had not resulted in formal discipline, but it existed, and it had not been disclosed. Non-disclosure of a prior complaint on a credentialing application is not a minor administrative issue. It is a material misrepresentation. It is the kind of thing that credentialing committees take very seriously. Third, I prepared a formal written submission, drafted with the help of an attorney who specialized in healthcare regulatory matters and who I found through a colleague, detailing the incident I had witnessed, the non-disclosure issue, and the pattern of conduct Melissa had described, all in the formal language and structured format that such submissions require. It was submitted to the appropriate committee at Mercy General's board, 62 days after the incident at Sandra's house. I am going to tell you what happened, and I am going to be honest about the timeline because I don't want to make this sound faster or cleaner than it was. The credentialing review was paused pending investigation. Kevin was notified. He retained an attorney. The investigation took 11 weeks. During those 11 weeks, Kevin was not offered the attending position that had been pending. It was held. During those 11 weeks, Kevin and Sandra made several attempts to contact me through various channels. I did not respond to any of them directly. My attorney responded on my behalf when responses were required. Melissa filed for divorce 6 weeks after the submission. Her attorney was thorough, and the documentation we had assembled made the proceedings clearer. The photographs, Jennifer's records, the advocate documentation, my written account as a witness made the proceedings clearer than they might otherwise have been. Kevin contested. His attorney argued. The documentation held. The investigation concluded that Kevin had materially misrepresented his prior conduct history on his credentialing application. The attending position was withdrawn. Kevin's fellowship was placed under a formal supervision requirement that would follow his record. He appealed. The appeal was denied. Kevin and Sandra hired a communications attorney who sent a letter suggesting that I had acted improperly in making the board submission. My attorney responded. The letter went nowhere. Because the submission had been made through correct channels, documented appropriately, and contained only information I had direct knowledge of, or that existed in legitimate records. I want to tell you about the afternoon. Melissa's divorce was finalized. She came to my house, and we sat in the kitchen, where I'd made coffee at 2 in the morning, 62 days after the incident. And she told me that she felt, for the first time in 3 years, like she could breathe all the way in. She said it just like that. Breathe all the way in. She's doing well now. Not easily. There is no easy version of what she went through, and I'm not going to tell you otherwise. She's in therapy. She has good people around her. She's going to be a wonderful mother in about 9 weeks. And the nursery in her apartment, not Sandra's vision of it, is exactly what she wanted it to be. Sandra called me once, about 4 months after everything concluded. She asked me how I could have done this to her family. I thought about several things I could have said. What I said was this. I told her that the moment she laughed, she made a choice, and that choices have consequences, and that she was experiencing hers. Then I wished her well and ended the call. If you have a child, a daughter, a son, anyone you love who is in something that hurts them, I want you to hear this. You don't have to blow up. You don't have to make a scene. You don't have to do anything in the moment that gives anyone a reason to make you the story. What you have to do is leave the room quietly, take your child with you, and then use every skill and every relationship and every piece of knowledge you have ever accumulated to make sure that what happened is seen, documented, and placed into the record where it belongs. The most powerful thing I did that night wasn't anything visible. It was reaching into my purse and scrolling to a name. 30 years of work, 1 phone call, and the knowledge that the right moment to use what you know is the moment when it matters most. Tell me in the comments if you've ever used everything you had to protect someone you love. Subscribe for more stories. I'll see you in the next one.